There is no moment of silence or bliss on the planet of the human psyche. Although the tornado on the emotional pole does break, as in the case of other animals, only from time to time, especially when insufficiently meticulous upbringing and education did not allow us to distance ourselves too much from our animal cousins, the tornado on the anxiety pole lasts the whole human life. Here, a dark sky is constantly born, full of ominous lightnings, storms, winds, and terrible trumpets that sweep away everything encountered on the road. The first great apes were just very, very unhappy. One could say that they all suffered from depression, the most severe possible. It's hard to believe how they managed to survive, since, as we know, in the most severe depression, you don't feel like eating, running, copulating, or anything. But we know what happens when the most severe depression affects us. If we allow it to develop, we don't give drugs, we don't try to relieve the suffering psyche as much as possible, then an unusual, although from the point of view of the laws of nature, natural phenomenon occurs. Well, one day, suddenly, a completely changed person appears before the eyes of people, smiling, relaxed, simply happy. The same person who had not reacted to the world around him the day before yesterday, frozen in an expression of indifference. What happened? Well, the nature, though severe, is not ruthless. Yes, all ailments are part of the world of nature, but at the same time, nature has developed mechanisms that seek to heal what is ailing, and it's often enough not to disturb the nature for a natural healing to take place. At every stage of a disease, the nature continues its efforts to heal it. Well, but instead of supporting the nature in this effort out of recklessness and ignorance or awkwardness, we often disturb. Then we make the healing process difficult for the nature. It is not drugs that heal. Good drugs are only those that do not interfere with the nature treatment. But the nature still seeks to heal the ailment, despite drugs that disturb most often. The desire to heal and to regenerate the organism is embedded in genes, which is perhaps the most powerful of all the features of living organisms written in their genes. And what happened to this poorly treated person with depression is an example of the effect of nature. So let's explain how the nature did it. What is this effect? Well, if the mental suffering of a depressed person exceeds the psychophysical capacity, the nature intervenes decisively. It turns off the source of suffering. So it turns off what exactly? Yes, it turns off the human psyche. Sounds absurd, even ridiculous, right? After all, as I mentioned, suddenly the person smiles again and the expression of suffering and anxiety disappears. Yes, nature stopped the senseless suffering. You could even say that it has healed. The problem is that the nature doesn't know a man from a horse or a cow. Thus, it sometimes happens that the cure takes place in a way that, from a human point of view, is inhuman. Suddenly, that sick person becomes as happy as animals are, what people don't know, because the person does not feel anxious anymore. The nature has extinguished the anxiety pole in the psyche of a person with severe depression. It's not without reason that I write that a person suffering so far can be happy from now on, happy the way the unipolar animals are like. I believe that it was similar, albeit in an enormous scale, with the first humanoid primates. All or almost all of them went into severe depression in their early adulthood, the culmination of which, if they survived, was post depressive psychosis. This shift of the psyche from the bipolar to unipolar position should be called just like that. This is exactly why depression must be stopped in time, so that there is no risk that nature will handle it on its own way, as it still happens today with the neglected or poorly treated depressive patients. And as it happened in a gigantic scale, as I say, millions of years ago with the great apes. So I suppose that these prehistoric apes were not able to bear the burden of the bipolar psyche, and after a dozen or so years there was a switch, after which they became ordinary monkeys again. Ordinary because mentally, like all monkeys, except humans, they became unipolar again. An interesting question is what made these monkeys, bipolar monkeys, survive after all of which we are the best proof ourselves. In other words, psychological bipolarity was a tremendous burden from the very beginning, just as it's thereafter. But despite this, the only species affected by such bipolarity is not extinct, as it seems logical that it should. Moreover, it's the most numerous species today, the species at the top of the evolution ladder. So, this misfortune of bipolarity must paradoxically hide some secret of success. Let's explain it. The first thousand or so years of human life, yes, human because they were bipolar, was a very turbulent period in their lives. Constant fear and emotional storms made them unhappy. As long as they could still cling to the mother's hand or back as infants, as long as they wanted to play as children, this terrible anxiety was bearable. The mother's presence or a whirlwind of play helped to soothe it. No wonder that the prehuman monkeys were in no rush to adulthood. On the contrary, they extended it in an indecently long way, up to more than 10 years. Anyway, a long childhood was beneficial not only for the babies. Mothers also benefited from it because taking care of children played the same role for them as playing for the children. It allowed them to divert attention from the world of terrible anxiety. a thing that we practice until today. Male human prehistoric apes formed into larger groups for the same reason. It was already known to them that being in a group distracted from the great misfortune that they all carried, the misfortune of constant fear. So they distracted from it by finding new and new group activities. Males with a psyche whose anxiety pole potential was the lowest, and those of them who had enough cleverness and strength could devote more time to ordinary animal matters such as eating, sleeping, and especially copulating. Hence, it can be assumed that individuals with lower anxiety passed this gene more easily to their offspring than those with a higher anxiety pole potential. Let's imagine then how great the anxiety of anthropoid apes must have been, since even today, after several million years of evolution and the gradual elimination of the high anxiety gene, we still consider our anxiety as unbearable. Is it so difficult to imagine then that despite all efforts, perhaps even all human prehistoric apes fell into post depressive psychosis after a period of depression? They seemed to be becoming ordinary monkeys again because they were devoid of anxiety. But could they be, after several years of experiencing anxiety, the same as the monkeys that had never experienced it? No. First of all, what a relief it is when you suddenly feel no fear as anxiety. Anyone who has had the opportunity to use any of the anxiolytic drugs, because such drugs exist, knows it well. But it's a poor comparison to the relief felt by a person who, after having suffered for many years from the anxiety, will suddenly be liberated from it. If there is a paradise, this is how we must feel there. Thus, prehuman apes, although at the end of their lives, like animal monkeys, did not feel fear. Unlike the latter, they did recognize a mental state that we call happiness. They did recognize a mental state that we call happiness. This is how not animal, but typically human contemplation of feelings was born. In the case of these primal prehuman creatures, it was of course only the seed of what we now understand as contemplation. It must have been only a seed, since the prehuman apes did not yet have such a medium like the rich interporal space. There were no words yet, no thoughts, no feelings, but the latter just started to sprout at the earliest, and it happened out of the experience of the misfortune of anxiety and then of the liberation from it. I mentioned that this liberation came at the end of their lives. It's hardly surprising, after the hardships of life since birth in the hell of anxiety, after a dozen of or so years, they were uh, they were the same, and as I have described earlier, probably much more mentally disturbed than people suffering from long-term severe depression now. And just like our contemporaries, the millions of years ago living ancestors of man learned the taste of the happiness of life without anxiety, and that was enough for them to be fully satisfied. Often they stopped caring for food and safety then, In such conditions, it was not difficult to die, and they died very quickly, but they died happy. Young monkeys, the unhappy ones, were learning an important lesson when looking at the fate of their older kin, namely, their life will not be obnoxious forever. Thus, another material, the hope, was born in the primary interpolar space. And it's important to notice that first hope was born, and only then at the end of life another element of this space appeared, the feeling of happiness. It's clear that the interpolar space was painstakingly built up as a cure for the madness of anxiety, as a weapon against its destructive power. And this space owes its origin to what we call now depressive post-depressive psychosis. The liberated from anxiety humanoid animal is amazed at this sudden event. From astonishment, which is a phenomenon on the border of other animal psyche abilities, it's just a small step to something that no other animal on earth can do, to self-reflection. Today it's ordinary, obvious, but a few million years ago, what happened in the psyche of our animal ancestors must have amazed them enormously. We touch here the most, I think, fascinating moment in the entire history of life on Earth, because it was the time when the unaware of its own existence nature, after many hundreds of millions, even billions of years, finally reached the crowning point of this long, in cosmic and even terrestrial terms, Odyssey. Can it be better crowned with anything else than this with this moment, very metaphorically speaking, and in a gigantic shortcut in which a stone lying by the road suddenly becomes aware of itself? Consciousness is the content of the interpolar space. It was born in evolution completely by accident and not immediately complete. It was created to combat anxiety and, as you might suspect, also emotions. Consciousness arose then as a result of the first psychosis of the psyche of primal monkeys. Since without this primal psychosis there would be no awareness, perhaps the opposite is also true. Moreover, since the original psychosis turned out to be so salutary for getting out of the vicious circle of suffering of the bipolar anxiety emotional psyche, perhaps we are entitled to suppose that such a phenomenon is still valid. Maybe we shouldn't treat it as something inappropriate or undesirable.